I'm really excited to show you some of the really cool things we've done at St. Mary's. Real quick before we get started, there's a few links up on the slides here. You can pull up the slides in several ways. I've got them on SlideShare. They're on the conference website on the session page. They're also at this little short link at stmarytx.edu/silos, although I know our domain isn't necessarily the quickest to remember. Also want to mention that the code for all of these examples is up on GitHub. I know y'all cannot stare at an eye chart of thousands of lines of code on slides. It just doesn't work that way. So if you want to check it out later or even during the session, they're all there. And then finally, as Jen said, if you have any questions, feel free to post them on the conference website. I've tried to build in time, but we'll see how that goes. So first off, I have a few questions for you guys. Who out here in the audience is an introvert? There's a fair share of y'all. I am too. Who's afraid of?
Say anything are too much of an introvert.
Well, that's true. I'm sure there's a few hidden among us. Who is afraid of public speaking? I just wanted to bring this up because, for one thing, I really relate to the Wizard of Oz up here. Over here behind the curtain telling you, pay no attention to what I'm doing back here, over doing all the cool stuff. But I wanted to mention it because I wanted to ask your forgiveness if I stumble a little bit. This isn't my forte. My forte is making the code and making things work behind the scenes. But more important than that, I want to encourage all of you. Each of you has an area of expertise that we could all benefit from. And we actually have some really good speaker training materials on the WPCampus site. So I encourage each of you to consider coming up here next year, or maybe at our online conference, which is a little less nerve-wracking. So back to our main topic today. Overall, we're talking about getting and displaying information from the various systems you may have on the web. And I think you guys are probably pretty familiar with having a lot of disparate sites, and also with knowing that the user experience is not always the best when somebody has to go to one website and then they click to another and all the navigation has changed, the branding maybe looks really different. It's just not the best user experience. So first off, I'm going to provide just a little background and context of St. Mary's University websites, just so you have a feel for kind of what we are working from. Then I have 4 real-world integrations to show you some good examples. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with a few tips overall to try to encourage you to find the best practices for connecting your own silos. So overall, our institutional website, our www, is a WordPress site. And that's important for us because it really makes it easy for us to add whatever functionality we want, style it, make it all look very cohesive on the front, even if all the code sources that it's coming from are crazy, which sometimes they are. Another thing to know about our main institutional site is we really hone in on an audience, which is prospective students. We're lucky in that alumni have their own separate website. Our law school actually has its own separate website. And even our current students go to the intranet, and they've been trained very heavily that the internal audiences have their own site that's not going to be publicly available. So that really impacts what we want to show on this main institutional site. It gives us, here's our audience. Well, what type of information will prospective students specifically be seeking? We do, of course, like probably every one of you in this room, have dozens of other websites, everything from Banner for employee and student data to EMS for our calendar and room booking. And again, we have those separate WordPress sites that sometimes we also want to connect to the main site. So our first integration has gone back and forth a few times over the years. On this slide, on the left side, I have an old screenshot back when it was just PHP that tunneled straight into Banner, no CMS, no nothing. And then on the right, once we moved to WordPress, initially, this was still kind of a cluster of PHP and custom cron jobs and things. So it really doesn't look visually much different. You can kind of see there's a WordPressy sidebar added onto it, but the functionality didn't really change once we initially moved it to WordPress. Once we moved a couple of years ago to a managed host, though, everything changed. because all these special PHP files that really weren't plugins, weren't themes, were their own thing, the managed host didn't want all that on their servers. So at that point, IT broke it off onto its own separate subdomain, totally separate code base. I think they had it in Java instead of PHP at that point. But the challenge with that was also a time when on the institutional site, we were updating styles a lot. We were playing with our top navigation, trying to trim the hedges and really overhaul our information architecture. And so IT was constantly having to apply these new CSS styles to make the directory look like the site, constantly having to update the links in that top navigation. So it was a little bit of a struggle right at that point. The other challenge we had was that there were really two silos of information still. Even when the directory was on WordPress before we moved to that managed host, you had the banner information in the directory, and you had completely separate WordPress faculty bios and really nice headshots of them. So there's these two totally separate bits of information that should be connected but weren't at that time. So that was a challenge we really wanted to overcome. One of the really cool things about my particular position at St. Mary's is I have a lot of autonomy. So I get to choose and help influence a lot of the projects that we go through for the web. And I've decided I really would like to connect this information. Let's get those faculty headshots into the directory so that if a prospect is searching for somebody, they can put a face to a name. Let's get those bios linked out so they can also get a little extra information about them. So when I first decided to connect this information, I figured, well, PHP just tunneled into Banner before, let's do that. Not so much when you're on a completely separate offsite host. That only worked when it was on the campus network. So with Banner being such a closed system, the good thing was the person in IT who was maintaining that separate directory on its own was also the person who had kind of the keys to the kingdom of Banner information. And he basically asked, instead of just saying, no, you can't do that, he basically asked me, well, what information are you needing? Is this something that we could figure out a way for you to get? And he ended up getting me a beautiful export of all this information that I needed of the Banner information. So employee names, titles, departments, their rooms, their buildings, all that stuff, because it was publicly available. So even though I wasn't tunneling directly into Banner, he built this awesome JSON web service, which at the time I wasn't familiar with, but it's just great structured data that's pretty easy to parse through with PHP. So I've got a little bit of snippets of code here, but again, GitHub has everything. But basically, in a nutshell, how it works is there's a cron job that runs every hour, so we keep it in sync fairly often, but we don't kill the server either doing it too often. And also that way, visitors don't have to wait. If we waited until they're at the page and we reached out to get the Banner information and the WordPress employees and the law WordPress employees, because again, they're on their own separate site, that would take forever. So we have this cron job that comes and does it for us automatically. I did want to briefly mention too, there's a little difference between cron jobs. There's server cron jobs that just always run based on the server. And then there's WordPress cron jobs that are only triggered when someone's actively viewing the site. So if you're going to set up an integration like this, you have to kind of think about whether you need that to run all the time. For us, it only really matters to have that information present if someone's on the website. So if it doesn't kick off 1 hour because no one's on the site, that's okay, because there's nobody missing any information there. The cron job basically just JSON decodes the web service, all the Banner employee data, and at that point I have a PHP array of all the Banner information. So remembering that the directory is on the main website and that law site is totally separate, we use the REST API to pull in the faculty posts. And on that site, all the law employees happen to be in a faculty custom post type, which makes it really easy to isolate and just get the particular information that we want. Really the only trick here, the only reason for this large for loop at the bottom is because the REST API has, or at least had at the time I built this, and they may have changed it, a maximum of 100 results at a time. So this will tell you, here's the first 100 results, and also here's how many additional pages of results there are. So the for loop just goes through, gets those additional pages of results, and at that point I do an array merge, and we have all the law faculty in a separate array from the banner faculty. Now with the REST API, featured images are separate, so there's another little bit of code there to get the featured image for each of these. And then we add each of the employees into an array. At this point, we also need to get the main institutional site posts, but again, since the directory lives there, we just do a simple get posts, and at this point we have that combined with the law faculty, with the main institutional site faculty. So we have the WordPress data in an array and the banner data in an array. So you can see it's little building steps building up to finally combining them all together. So in order to merge that data, we need a unique key to match on and say, well, what banner employee corresponds to this WordPress employee? And in our case, it's an email address. That's the unique key that we always have for every employee. So we loop through the banner array of employees, find that email address. Inside that, there's an additional loop to loop through all the WordPress employees and find the matching employee. Pretty soon, we're actually going to be removing the email address itself from the site because there's just been so many phishing attempts. And so we're going to need a separate unique key that we'll be replacing that with, but there's already plans in place for that. But either way, you have to have some kind of a key to combine the data. And then by this point, we have everything in a single array, and it can be JSON encoded back and included on the page kind of in a roundabout way I won't elaborate much on because it protects our data a little bit more from having it really easy for somebody to just grab all employee emails all at once. So here's the end result, and you can view this live on our site at stmarytx.edu/employees. At the top, you can either browse by last name or you can do a keyword search, and that searches a few different fields. And then underneath, you have the combined results of the banner data with the WordPress data. So there's an image fallback in all this code so that there's always an image in that left-hand column that comes from WordPress, which is either the featured image or just the fallback, and that helps the columns line up, so it's really easy to just skim through. Then in the middle, we have their banner data, like their name, their title and department. And then if they have a WordPress bio, whether it's on the law site or the main site, there's a link out to that, and then kind of the rest of the banner data. So it works really well together. The next few examples I wanted to show are using WordPress in other WordPress data in other WordPress sites. How many of you guys have more than one WordPress site? I'm guessing it's quite a few. Yeah, it's at least half the room for those of you on the live stream that can't see the hands. So one example we have here is we publish our news articles and our alumni magazine articles on our main institutional site. But of course, there's other sites like the alumni site where their audiences are really interested in the same information. Well, we don't just want to copy those and syndicate them throughout all of our different subdomains. We just want to share that data. So on the left side of this slide, there's an original magazine article on the main site. And then on the right side, there's two different places that can appear. In that gold stripe on the law homepage, there's magazine articles and news posts. And then at the bottom on the alumni homepage, we have a little bit more than just that image and title. There's also a little excerpt and a few more links to really highlight that alumni magazine content that's not on the alumni website. There are really a lot of different ways to push and pull content between WordPress sites. Before the REST API came out, we used RSS pretty heavily. In case you aren't aware, WordPress creates a number of RSS feeds on its own just in the background for you, and you can customize them by adding custom templates to your theme. So when we were using the RSS, we used fetch feed, which also will pull in any RSS feed. It doesn't have to be WordPress specific. So if you have any other sites that can spit out a feed, you can parse them this way into your WordPress site. Then we have a few regular expressions here, and again, I know the code is tiny, so check it on GitHub if you're really interested. But basically, the regular expressions here are used to strip out things like H2s and block quotes that on the magazine we get really heavily into HTML formatting, and we don't want that to mess up the alumni homepage formatting. So we strip all that HTML out. We take out the read more that Yoast likes to add to the excerpts. And because the RSS feeds didn't have the featured images, we also parsed through to find the first image tag in that article and use that to display visually on the home pages. Now these days, instead of RSS, we have the REST API that just works a little bit smoother. So we use WP Remote Get, which pulls in any WordPress REST API site that is publicly available. And one of the things that's very different about RSS versus the REST API is RSS is really controlled by the publisher. So they control how many items are in the feed, what shows there. But with the REST API, you're really pulling the specific information you want and the amount of information you want. So the site that's pulling in the data actually has more control with the REST API. So this is a simplified stripped down version of the code. The full one includes a fallback image just so we don't break any layouts anywhere. And also we get pretty finicky about our formatting on some things like months. So for example, not wanting to cover the pictures too much, we shorten our month names to 3 characters. But of course the month of May is 3 characters. So there's a little conditional code there. If there's May, there's no period. If it's a different month, there's a period. Little tweaks like that. So our prospective students don't tend to seek out news articles and alumni magazine posts. They just don't sound appealing to them when we talk about them that way. But we have found through analytics and also just through the admissions department talking to us that when prospective students read this kind of information, they really get a better feel for the university. So one of the things we've wanted to do is actually connect information within our main institutional site and link to it in a few different ways. So over here in the gold band, we're about as close to a typical WordPress homepage as our site gets, which is to pull in reverse chronological order some of our posts. And just like the law homepage, we have magazine and news posts there. But in addition to just the homepage, which obviously isn't everyone's landing page, we have what we call the post connector shortcode that we built. This way we can put it wherever we want within the site. And there's a couple of different ways we can do this. On the left, there's a Center for Catholic Studies example where we show text links, and that just keeps everybody updated on that type of content. And on the right, at the bottom of every post, we also have our little visual, the image display of them. And for the magazine articles, we have an issue taxonomy so that we can link to all the articles from this issue that you've just been reading from, or the next story in that same issue. And that way we can keep people reading. Once they reach the bottom, they can go, oh, I can continue. This is a cohesive thing. It's not an isolated silo. So the first part of our code basically shows you this post connector is a shortcode. We will be looking into making it a block eventually, but that's further down the horizon. And the circled part shows you that this shortcode supports 5 attributes. So you can call it in a number of ways to isolate the specific content that you want it to pull in. Basically, you can pull by category, by tag. You can tell it how many posts you want it to show at a time. We have a school taxonomy, so we can restrict it to showing posts related to a certain school. And then there's that images attribute that controls whether it's going to come out as text links or as the images with a nice little overlay. And then basically if the shortcode was called with any of those attributes, we add those to the query and find those corresponding posts. We also have a little snippet so that that post not in parameter is added to the query, which basically means don't have a post that links to itself. And then we check that images attribute to determine, are we going to display with images as we do there on the home page, or are we going to display just those text links like we do on the Center for Catholic Studies, because we don't always have a featured image that goes well with those particular posts. Finally, at the end, we send them out into the world using a return statement. And I don't know how many of y'all have used or created shortcodes much, but if you've ever had a shortcode where no matter where you put it on the page, it started showing at the very top of the content above everything else, that's because when you echo something in PHP, it spits it out immediately. So it's really important to return that, and that's what will make sure that wherever you have actually put it in the flow of the content, that's where it will display, not at the top. How many of y'all have an ugly website? I think we probably all do. We might just not even be aware of all of them that are out there because there are so many sites. It could be, maybe it's just not visually appealing. It could be a poor user experience. Everything is in tables, in tables, in tables. There's so many reasons that you could consider a site ugly, even if it's not necessarily the visual aesthetic of it. Maybe the code just gives you nightmares. So our master calendar is one of these sites. And for us, we've used Master Calendar, which is an EMS product, for so long now, for so many years. There's just no decoupling our university from it. We're always going to use that for our calendar. Unfortunately, some of the limitations, besides just kind of this is not entirely our branding, we're able to apply some colors, but not really a lot to do with the layout. My bigger complaint about it, why I kind of consider it an ugly site, is the user experience. So you can't link directly to a specific calendar or to a specific month. So if someone is on the institutional site looking at calendar events, and they want to click over to see the additional details in Master Calendar, they actually get this homepage. That's all you can send them to, and they have to refine the specific calendar and refine the specific month. So it's just not the greatest user experience. Now, this is something we struggled with for a little while. We first decided to integrate this more into the main website during a full site redesign when we were also overhauling the information architecture. So we got so focused on pages like the home page that this kind of took a back burner. But I wanted to kind of show you the process. So when we first started this integration, RSS feeds were the only option that we knew of. Our staff could create different feeds based on specific criteria, so we could kind of narrow down, okay, here's the athletics events, here's the student life events, here's the registrar's academic calendar, and things like that. And then also tags, like here's all the Catholic related events and different things. Unfortunately, again, this attempt ended up ugly, but this is part of the process of getting it better. Here's what that actually looked like visually. And unfortunately, your eye doesn't really know where to go in this layout. So let me talk you through it a little bit. Even with the custom RSS feeds that our staff were making, we just had so many events, it was really hard to display them. So we tried adding an accordion, and I don't know if you can see very well, this general right here was actually a tab of an accordion. Most people didn't recognize that visually. Because you could only see a few days worth of data at a time, we also wanted to make sure people knew about the really bigger events coming up. So we added a sidebar of featured events that could go out further into the future. And again, I don't know if your eye chart can see up here, but in the general calendar, there's 5 events from the same day, and that's about all you can see in that first screen without scrolling. In the featured events, we really narrowed it down so you could see a couple weeks into the future and at least get them visually available to people that way. We also ended up with some stakeholders who wanted to have the submit an event button very high and prominent. That was a little bit before we enforced more of the website is for prospective students. We need to cut down the clutter for our internal audiences elsewhere. And because we knew this layout wasn't really finely tuned and optimized, if you just kind of squint at this, there's one thing that your eye will go to, and that's this gold button that says See Full Calendar. So all it did was rearrange the data a little bit and still drove people back over to Master Calendar. But then things started getting better from here. So first off, analytics are extremely helpful when you're telling people that something's really got to change here. If you can show in Google Analytics, everybody, 98% who are hitting this events page are abandoning ship and going to the master calendar, it's obvious that there's a reason that we don't have enough data or we haven't structured it well enough and they're just going back to what they're used to. We also had heat maps going, so you could see that nobody scrolled down to even see that there were additional calendars. So everybody was seeing the general calendar. If they wanted the academic calendar that was further down, they didn't even realize that was on the page. We were just finding that there were so many events, the RSS feeds weren't enough to really hone in on the specific ones we wanted to find. So once we called the vendor, we found out, hey, there's actually an API here. Maybe we can use that to get a little more precise in our queries. Of course, it's a paid API, but we recognized the value in it and we were able to pull some budget for it. The biggest letdown, unfortunately, on this API was it doesn't come through with the tags. So things like our Catholic events that are not a specific calendar, they're a tag, you cannot get that data out of the API. But even without that, it still did let us lay out the calendar as a calendar, which is what you see today. A lot better, a lot less cluttered than that first attempt. So in this current version, instead of that long accordion that nobody realized were there, we just have little buttons along the top. You can determine if you want the academics, the athletics calendar, just the law events. You can also select from a drop-down to jump really quickly to a month in the past or the future. There's actually a lot of code and logic that went into this one, but basically we check the query string to see whether someone is asking for a specific calendar or a specific month. If there's no query string, they get the general calendar for the current month. And then we call the API, get whatever data we're asking for, the specific events, and we have to calculate in PHP the day we want the calendar to start on, which is even a little trickier because it's not just that we want it to start on a Sunday, but in this month, Sunday isn't the first, so we want to show an empty block for Sunday and then go to Monday where we actually show the events. And then instead of having that sidebar for the featured events, they just show up in gray in the flow of exactly where they appear in the timeline. So they're still prominent, but they don't have to be separate anymore. And we have a mobile styling on this as well to alternate colors and just make it easier to see where one day ends and the next day begins. So besides just what you visually see on a desktop screen or a mobile screen, I also want to encourage you to consider your structures, making the data clear too. One way to do this is to use schema.org vocabulary, which was created by search engines like Google and Bing and a couple of others. They actually acknowledge this, and it's what they use for a lot of their structured data inputs. With Schema, you wrap each item, so each event, in an HTML tag. Here, everything is in its own little div, just so it's very distinct, and here's this one piece we're marking up. You add an item type attribute to that one div or whatever element. It can be any element. And the item type links to the particular schema definition that you're defining. So here it's event. Every schema has a different set of item props, which are the properties. So things like your start date, your location, the event status, whether it's canceled or still scheduled. And an extra benefit of marking this up, besides being great for search engines and great for things like screen readers, you also, if you search for St. Mary's events and you happen to be in a geolocation where St. Mary's is our St. Mary's, you will actually see, in addition to the main events page, there are separately marked up events upcoming underneath it. So bonus free SEO site links we don't have to pay for. Next, I have another banner integration to show. This time, instead of employees, it's the course schedule. So in our lingo at St. Mary's, a program is anything like a major, a minor, a certificate, a course of study. As we were working on the program pages, which all have their own page on the main institutional site, we wanted to show some sample classes, help people see themselves in this major, help them kind of see what their schedule might possibly look like, what types of specific subjects they're going to study. So I hit up that same IT friend who helped build the banner web service for employees. He very gladly acquiesced and built a web service to get at the course schedule as well. So in this little slide, you can basically maybe squint and see that this plugin creates a database table to actually hold all this data because it's just so much information. Now on this plugin, we have two separate cron jobs. It's so labor intensive, all the processing, having it as separated out prevents a timeout. So the first cron job saves the banner courses to the WordPress database. And in the second pass, it actually parses through and applies the data. So this is the first pass right here. Depending on the current month, it calculates which semesters to get courses for. So July being month 7, this would tell it, go out and get this summer and this fall and next year's spring. Those are the 3 semesters we want to be looking at. This one is actually an XML web service, so we use simple XML load string. And it gets things like the catalog prefix, like AC for accounting, the level, is it graduate, undergraduate, which semester it's being offered, what days and times. Then in the second cron job, we use that information that we've pulled from Banner and apply it to the WordPress data. So we query for posts, which are those program pages that have a course prefix as post meta assigned to them. Then it goes through the courses in the database, checks to see which are offered online or evenings, and if it is, it adds a special post meta flag to that specific program. Hey, this has online courses available. Hey, this one has evening courses available. Finally, it loops through and adds that. So now that we have the data, what can we do with it? Well, we found 2 things we could do with it. The first one is what I mentioned earlier about showing classes on the program page. So you can glance through, and by the way, I can glance through and say, this is not the major for me. Math is not my forte. It also gives us the opportunity to give visitors a taste of the schedule in specific classes. The other thing that we can do with that outside of the individual program pages was on our all degrees and programs page. So we have this one page that lists all the majors, minors, certificates, everything. Up at the top, we have a little search by interest where you can search for something like math, and we have keywords loaded, so it will come up with accounting, physics, engineering. But a lot of students aren't just looking for that topic that they want to study. A lot of them need a specific schedule. Some may need online classes because they're never going to move to San Antonio. Some might need evening courses because of their work schedule. So doesn't it make sense to make it easy for them to find this information? So for a while we added a section to this page, and this is a crazy egg page, so that's why it's such a dark screenshot. But it's showing you that because we added this section, we actually had a big new two big spots that people were clicking a lot, and they became some of our more popular pages. One for the programs that had online classes, and the other for the evening classes. But now for the bad news. In our situation, our online classes are actually often remedial. That's not available to every student. Most of the evening classes don't add up to a complete degree. So we took this functionality down off of the website just so we weren't misrepresenting how many online and evening classes we truly had. So in conclusion, I did want to share a few tips. First is to focus on your users. So who is your audience? What is it that they're looking for? Don't just connect things for the sake of connecting things, especially since once you make a connection, you really have to maintain that connection. Look through your analytics. Find things like the search terms that people use. Look at page navigation paths. If you can't see multiple sites in your analytics, either take some time and set that up, or just do some real-world user testing. See what sites are people looking on for specific information. You may be beating yourself on the head going, oh, You just have to click this one link, but people aren't recognizing it. So find out what their problem points are and see what you can do to connect that data better for them. Number 2, don't duplicate your content. And I think y'all probably know better than to do this, but even if visitors to 3 different sites need the exact same information, just duplicating that is not going to do anyone any favors. Once it's copied, it's really hard to keep track of which system is it in, who owns that, who's going to update it at the same time the others are updated. You don't want to advertise outdated information, and you don't want to cause yourself SEO problems competing for the same spot. Tip 3 is to find keys. So anytime you want to connect 2 silos, you have to have a reliable way to associate that data back to each other. So remember, in the directory, we were using the email address. You need to know you can rely on consistent data in both of your systems to keep that connection working. And it's always easier to use something that already exists than try to retrain someone in a different CMS to add new data. Usually you can find a key. Occasionally you may need to make one. Number 4 is to look for APIs. They're usually the fastest and most structured way to get the data. Use the REST API if you're working with WordPress. Check with your vendors because, again, we used those RSS feeds and they were so clunky until we just asked, hey, do you have an API? Yes, we do. If there's not an API or it doesn't offer you that functionality, like we couldn't get the tags out of ours, you can try those RSS feeds. And think of scraping as a last resort. It's usually not very efficient to parse through a whole page, and if anything changes in that CMS, you may be setting yourself up for failure. So always try to look for APIs first with RSS as a fallback. And last but not least, make friends, as we learned earlier today. If you have a good relationship with the keeper of a system, it's going to be easier to find a way to connect your data. And you should forge relationships not just by asking for help, like me asking for the banner data, but also offer whatever you can. If you have analytics, they may not have access to that information. Ask them what they need. Build that relationship. I think we have just a few minutes for questions. Also, if you think of anything after the session, I will be looking back at that page, so feel free to post them there. And don't forget to post the feedback. Or catch me later.
I have a question about the employee page, especially how the search works. Because it looks like that data doesn't get stuffed back into WordPress, right?
That is correct. It gets, again, I'm going to be a little vague on exactly how I include that information, but it's searchable by JavaScript. So we have a script on that page that parses through this information that's included from the external source where I dump it.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure.
Can you talk about caching a little bit? So you're hitting these APIs, and especially like the directories, I can't imagine a professor bio changes on a daily or weekly or even monthly basis. Are you caching some of that data, or are you just running these crons all the time?
They run every hour because of some internal things. Mostly it's the banner data, that if someone leaves the organization or their information is incorrect and it's not updated, we want that information immediately available. So they do run every hour. There's some level of caching during that hour, but it keeps expiring. So that's probably something we could optimize better. Anybody else? Well, thanks again for taking the time to spend this 45 minutes with me.